Hello and welcome to week 9 of New Testament Introduction to New Testament. Today we're going to be looking at Hebrews and 1st and 2nd Peter. This again a whole lot of material to cover, but I have a feeling this is going to be a short lecture because a lot of this stuff is going to be very familiar to you if you're reading through the New Testament and participating in the course, which everybody is. So let's jump into it. Okay, the author of Hebrews is unknown. I grew up thinking that Paul wrote it, or in other words, pastors always told me that Paul wrote it, but we really don't know. It's anonymous. That means that nobody claimed authorship in the beginning of the letter, which is a little strange, but it's possible that that has been lost. Um, People have assumed that because it mentions Timothy in an intimate way, that it was written by Paul. But a lot of other people knew Timothy, and this particular letter, the Hebrew of Hebrews, does not correspond with Pauline theology almost at all. It's something that is entirely independent of Paul's thinking. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, but I have just made this point right here. And the letter also was written for further distribution, and that's really important because we saw in the letter of Colossians that they were supposed to share with their letter with the Laodiceans, and the Laodiceans were to share the letter with the Colossians. So the early churches were told by Paul or by pseudo Paul, which is fake Paul, to exchange letters. And so we get a very good look at what was happening in the early church. The church in Rome would receive a letter from Paul or an authoritative letter from Asia Minor, and they would share it in turn with churches in Spain. And churches in Spain would share it with churches in Alexandria. So the exchange of letters between the churches and also exchange of gospels happened at a very, very early point in Christian history. So that's something that's interesting to me about the historicity of this letter. And Paul never did that, by the way. Okay, place and time of writing. Most probably, the epistle to the Hebrews was written in Rome, and it's most likely written late, that is, after the life and time of Paul. There's no mention of the destruction of the temple, so some people have dated it early. But the church structure that is present in the epistle to the Hebrews suggests it's written a lot later than that. And the reason why the temple is not mentioned is because it's written in Rome by a Gentile, someone who didn't care so much that the temple had been destroyed. And it was written in Rome and not Jerusalem, so that particular historical event doesn't have as much impact, on the other side of the world. So that's why we think that the Epistle to Hebrews is most likely written late and not by Paul. The intended readership of Hebrews. Now this is really interesting to me because the content of Hebrews has a whole lot of references to the Old Testament. And it leads you to think that it was written at a time when the Gentiles and Jews were unified in Christianity. But this actually was written late, and it was written after the break had been complete between Christianity and Judaism, and Christianity was its own entity. However, it has been important, even to this day, that Christians are united with the Old Testament theologically. That is, we have the same God as the Old Testament Christians always want to prove that. We are fulfilling the prophecy of the Old Testament, and we are a historically smooth. We have a historically smooth connection. In other words, Judaism has its beginnings with Abraham, and then the relationship of the Jews with God, or God's chosen people, goes all the way back to Adam. So Christianity, we say, is a smooth transition from the Jews that worship God in the Old Testament to the Gentiles who worship God in the New Testament, along with some Jews. So that started very early, and when you're reading Hebrews, it's very, very clear that the author wants a smooth transition from ancient Judaism to present Christianity. And this has been taken up, this topic has been taken up by Christian apologists, that is, people who want to give a reason for the faith, argue logically for Christianity. Christians are doing that to this day, and sometimes they do it to the exclusion of Jews, and sometimes they do it to the inclusion of Jews. Like the promises of God to Jews are still in effect, and we need to appreciate the relationship that God has with his chosen people. So we see the earliest, I think, example of a Gentile Christian wanting to connect Judaism and Christianity in Hebrews. And so the intended readers are people that would benefit from this kind of thing. Now, I want you to know that in the Bible, there were God-fearers mentioned. And God-fearers were Gentile believers in God who attended synagogue, but they did not follow the dietary restrictions of the Jews. So that looks a lot like Christianity, only it's flipped. The Gentiles are outsiders, and the Jews in the synagogue are insiders. And when Paul comes along and talks about how you don't have to practice those dietary laws anymore to be fully accepted, then the Jews are outsiders, and they have to give up their kosher lifestyle in order to fellowship with Christian brothers. So there was a movement in early Christianity, and we see it in the Gospels, we see it in Paul, and we especially see it in Hebrews, to unify Jews and Gentiles under the common faith. But in Hebrews, it's clearly the opposite, where the Gentiles are the insiders. They didn't have to give up any of their religious beliefs in the one true God in order to become a Christian, but the Jews do. So the writer of Hebrews says that the readers have become sluggish and dull in their faith. They're neglecting church attendance, and they must start with the fundamentals. And there's also a theme of the apostasy from faith and second repentance. And this is really important because in Hebrews, there was a persecution of Christians, and a lot of Christians were denying the faith and then wanting to join back in the Christian fellowship, and that's what second repentance is about. They repent from their sins again, and therefore they can be accepted in the community. Okay, there's, like I said, the intended readers had a problem of denying the faith, and let me tell you, there was a pretty big pressure on them to deny the faith. We know in the Epistle of Pliny, he was a governor of Melanthia, where Christians were, and he found 2 Christian slaves. They were both women, and he tortured them to death. And they gave up the location of the other Christians, and he brought them in and made them either either reject Christ 3 times, like Peter, or they would be killed. And he also said that they would have to make a sacrifice to Caesar in order to show that they're no longer a Christian anymore, because no Christian could do that. So Christians were under a lot of pressure in some areas to give up their churches and their new families, and some of these people made it out alive, and the Christian community had a very tough choice. Do we want to accept a repentant person back into the community, or are we going to let them suffer the consequences of the betrayal and remain outside of the community? So this is something that Hebrews tackles, along with many other writings in the New Testament, especially the later ones. So Hebrews, if you deny the faith, you are profaning the covenant that God has with you. So he comes down on it pretty hard, and he says that you are to stand fast, and you're going to enter into the end times rest. Do not abandon the faith. Man, somebody messed this thing up. Okay, they had the Gentiles had a new confession, and so did the Jews if they believed in the saving work of Jesus Christ. And the author of Hebrews is writing to a group that is having to face persecution right after they have converted to Christianity. Okay, this is more on the differences between Paul and Hebrews, in case anyone thinks that Paul wrote this epistle. The justification by faith is not important in Hebrews. It's barely even present. And this is important because we saw in the very earliest writing of Paul, in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, we have the kernel of justification by faith, and then it's expressed in its most perfected form in Galatians and in Romans. And it's something that is in every one of Paul's genuine letters. Now, if Paul would have written Hebrews, we would see some footprint of his justification by faith, and it's simply not there. Now, Paul and Hebrews do agree that if you look here between the S, the law cannot provide salvation. That's something that they agree, and also that Christ reveals the weaknesses of the law. However, they're talking about the different laws. Hebrews is talking about cultic law, like laws of concerning worship, like the kosher laws, eating the unclean foods and such. And Paul is talking about the prescriptive law, which is basically the whole thing. You remember Paul talking about if you break one law, you've broken the entire law. Paul's not concerned with just laws concerning worship or laws concerning theology. Paul was concerned about following the law in order to be saved. And as you know, he argues against that, which is not present in Hebrews. Okay, on to 1 Peter. Now, we don't know who the author is of 1 Peter. Traditionally, in the early days of the church, when Christians were writing in 300 and 400 CE, they believed that Simon Peter wrote this, and most likely it's not. It looks like a later Christian writing. It has a sophistic Greek style that Simon Peter would not have, which is sophistic means Basically, it's literal. He follows a literary Koine Greek instead of an oral Koine Greek, like other New Testament documents. The um, apostles were fishermen, and one was a tax collector, one was a doctor. Most likely, all of them were illiterate, with the exception of Luke. Luke was a doctor, and doctors studied written texts, but there are plenty of doctors who could not read. We're going to give uh, Luke the benefit of the doubt. But most of them were fishermen, and they were poor. They couldn't read. And so their Gospels reflect oral traditions. It was passed down orally and then written down. First Peter, on the other hand, follows literary style, which is the written style of Greek from the more educated people in the ancient world. In other words, we think that, especially because he cites the Septuagint all the time, that the writer was literate himself and follows that written style. So that's a pretty significant difference. And also, the writer is a presbyter, refers to himself as a presbyter, not an apostle. Again, if Simon Peter would have written it, he would have definitely called himself an apostle and not a presbyter. The difference is, not only is a role different, but it reflects a different organization of the early church. The presbyters were overseers, and they come after the first generation of the church. And the only office which was around in the first generation was apostle. So, we see that church structure is a lot of the argument as to why a document comes later, because we know a little bit about how the early church structure developed. Now, he cites the Old Testament primarily from the Septuagint, which is not surprising because most Jews read knew the Septuagint anyway. But I haven't looked into it in First Peter per se, but I can tell you that most of the quotations in the Bible of the Old Testament are hard to identify because they do not follow the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, and they also do not follow the Septuagint that we have. We have many copies of the Septuagint, just like the Bible, and like when Paul quotes the Old Testament, he never quotes word for word the Septuagint or word for word what the Hebrew would have said, like as if he would have translated it himself. So it's not unusual that the writer who's writing in Greek cites the Greek Old Testament. Most likely, this document is pseudepigraphical. Pseudo means false, and pigrapha means writing. It's a falsely attributed writing to Peter. Okay, the place and time of composition is unknown. You can see there's a pretty big 35-year gap between 65 and 100 CE. But most scholars think that it was written around 90 CE because of the church structure. And we don't know where it came from. Okay, this is something else that's interesting about the authorship. The audience dictates the authorship just a little bit because how you perceive your audience, we can tell how the author perceives the audience, and that perception gives us a reflection of the author. I hope that makes sense. The author, addresses Christians in Roman provinces, Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Bithynia is where Pliny the Younger was from. In 90 CE, he recorded, as governor, his persecution of Christians. Now, the audience is primarily Gentile Christians who live with and associate with the Roman provinces. If it was a Jewish author, or a strictly Jewish author, like they're not very Hellenized, they would not have referred to these 5 areas by their Roman provincial names. Okay, the audience is mostly Gentile Christians, and there are some reasons for this. Is the repeated reference to their repentance from worshiping idols and from their barbaric Gentile ways. So we think that obviously this is probably not a Jew writing to Jews, and also their call to become part of the people of God. They were not already part of the people of God. And then also, some husbands of Christian women are explicitly Gentile. Slaves are in the community, perhaps also slave owners, but we don't know for sure. The reason why I think slave owners are there is because in the household codes, Paul says for slaves to obey their masters. And it wouldn't, it makes sense that, okay, Christians would teach slaves to go and obey their unbelieving masters. But the thing is, how would the slaves be in the community if they were not attending with their masters? You can't just leave the house anytime you want and go to a Christian meeting. In order for slaves to be present, they would have to be with their Christian masters. So whenever the teacher that wrote Hebrews says for slaves to obey masters, it's most likely that the slave was sitting right beside his or her master in the community, in the worship service. And that is called social stratification. That's why I wrote stratified here. That means that there are different strata of social status. There's some lower status, some in the middle, and very, very few at the top. Masters and slaves. Okay, a lot of 1 Peter deals with suffering, and this is one thing that makes the letter so special, because as Christians we can look to this epistle for guidance whenever we're suffering, and it seems like we're suffering more than we deserve sometimes, but there's always hope. The Greek word translated suffer appears 42 times in 1 Peter. And 1 Peter is not a very long epistle. It's one of the shortest writings in the New Testament. And to see something like that repeated so often, it just brings to mind the suffering that Christians were under whenever they were governed by someone like Pliny the Younger. And I've mentioned Pliny several times because he was the governor of one of the provinces mentioned in 1 Peter. Okay, basic theological ideas. What does this say about God? And this, the first point comes from the idea of suffering, the theme of suffering. This world is not a place for Christians. It's a basic theological idea. And reason for this is we have new life in Christ. And that's why we are suffering in persecution, but we have a joyful hope of his return. And baptism is the catalyst for this teaching, that we are suffering, the last point, we are suffering as Christ suffered. We are suffering with Christ. buried with Christ in baptism, and raised to walk in newness of life, with a joyful hope that Christ will return. So the theological idea of suffering is bound up in the person of Jesus Christ. So, more on suffering, 42 times. It appears as a result of Christian conduct. I had alluded to that on the previous slide. The reason why Christians were persecuted is because the man was the head of the household back then, and the oldest man, and his religion was the religion of the household. And it wasn't the deal that the head of the household wasn't watching over everyone's religion all the time. But if you converted to Christianity that didn't like idols, that was imposing a different type of morality on the family, it could cause you a lot of heartache and pain because the head of the household controlled everything. They controlled or delegated the control of the family business, the way you get food into the household, the way that you marry. Every aspect of life had to be run by the head of the household, or done in such a way that the head of the household would approve it. So, when someone converted to Christianity from a Gentile household, they most likely were going to be cut off from every type of assistance that the household brings, and that basically includes everything. They have a capitalist economy where you can go out, if you're a son, you can go out and buy a car. If you have enough money, the father has to approve of everything. So Christians were exposed to every type of abuse from their neighbors and from their governors, from their families. So the idea here in 1 Peter that they are suffering as a result of their Christian conduct is absolutely 100% historically correct. And in suffering, he teaches, we encounter God's will. And it seems to me that some churches have really, really run too far in the idea that we experience Christ in our sufferings. And, some examples are how some churches glorify suffering. Suffering is the way that we see God, so we rejoice in suffering, but we don't glorify it and celebrate it. The thing that comes to mind is whenever you're in a Christian school and they see you misbehaving and they slap your wrist real hard with a ruler, and the child is suffering, and then the teacher says, "Well, you can experience Christ best when you're suffering." Or Christians who allow their bodies to be damaged and they fast just for the pleasure of suffering is just a little bit it goes a little bit too far, and it takes out of context the type of suffering that these early Christians were undergoing. And it also demonstrates that you are finished with sin and your unrighteousness has now become righteousness. So you can see there's a lot of motivation to bring suffering upon yourself in order to experience Christ in a fresh new way. But this is something that definitely was imposed on these early Christians, and this is how the author teaches them to get through it. Okay, 2 Peter. I'm sorry, I've been fighting a cold for about a week. Whoops. Apparently this didn't get in right. Sorry if this makes you dizzy. Oh, come on. Okay, this is really cool because we're getting back into um, the idea that, or the problem rather, whenever we encounter two different Christian writings that are very similar. Second Peter assumes almost all of the content of Jude, and this brings to mind Q, which is the idea that Matthew, Mark, and Luke had one similar source, which is Q, and it eventually became Mark, and then Mark appears in Matthew and Luke. So, I mean, it's really confusing, but uh, there's a lot of similar content there. So the problem is we have to sort out who was first, who's copying off of who knew what, and that's significant because the changes that they make tell you specific things about the community. Now, we're going to get into more detail about, specifically how Second Peter uses Jude, but it's something is that tells us a lot about the community. Now, the time and place of the composition was okay. It was around 110 CE, and we don't know where it's from. And the reason why it's dated like this is because there's two writings, one of that use Second Peter. One of them is the Apocalypse of Peter, which is a pseudepigraphical writing that originated in Christian churches. Sometimes some people think it's Gnostic. Um, I referred to it in the very first lecture of the course, but I don't expect you to remember that. Um, it's like the revelation of Peter. It's an apocalyptic end times writing. It was written about 135 CE, and it presumes Second Peter. It doesn't quote Second Peter, but it uses the material. And then First Clement, which is also a very early writing, it's written about 95 CE. It's very comparable to Second Peter. So because of those two writings that were dated between 90 and 135, scholars think it was written about 110. Okay, on Second Peter and Jude. The very first thing this teaches us about Second Peter is that Second Peter is promoting the acceptance of Jude. Jude is a tiny, one-page document in the New Testament, and you're when you copy something, you are bringing that material in and using it again in a different audience that may not have accepted the original document or the original material. So Second Peter is promoting the acceptance of Jude, and the writer shapes. I'm so sorry, I keep saying he. Could have been written by a woman. The writer shapes the material for a new historical situation, and it's what the writer excludes from Jude, the material from Jude that the writer of Second Peter excludes tells us more about the historical situation. And the first thing that the writer excludes is the polemic in Jude. And the reason why he excludes it is because the opponents that Jude faces are not the same opponents that Second Peter faces, and I'm not sure that Second Peter even addresses opponents. And the other thing that's missing is the wilderness warning. That is, we need to remember, in Jude, it says that we need to remember what happened to the Jews who were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. That can happen to us. We need to take that as a warning. That's excluded in Second Peter because it has a different situation. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It didn't come off when I said it as interesting as I thought it is, but there are other relationships that Second Peter has with the canonical New Testament. One of them is with Matthew, and the other is with Jewish literature. Now, with Matthew, Second Peter shares the Transfiguration story, the reference to Sodom and Gomorrah, the way of righteousness, and dogs and swine. You don't cast your treasure to your pearl to swine, or they'll come back and rip you to shreds. So there are some relationships, some contacts between Second Peter and Matthew. It's impressive, I think, that there are 4, because Second Peter is so short. Just makes every reference that much more significant. And also, whenever Second Peter references flood or water as a means of judgment for sinners, that is something that is widely used in Jewish literature. Now, there was one reference in, I believe it was in the Apocalypse of Peter, that had the flood as being a means of judgment, and but all the other references, there's like 20 references in Josephus and Philo and intertestamental, the Apocrypha, intertestamental literature of flood being used as a means of judgment. So that is Hebrews and 1st and 2nd Peter. I hope you all are enjoying reading the New Testament. We've finished Metzger, I think, with the midterm. So the only thing we've been doing is reading the New Testament for a few weeks. There's only one more lecture, so the end is near. I have at the top of this document a presentation for week 8, but it's actually week 9. So I also wanted to remind you to fully explore this course. In the YouTube videos section, there are videos that I've added about Ephesus and Corinth, and Philippi, and also the mystery religions. And also, there's I hate to say this as a teacher, but there's really easy extra credit opportunities for you guys. And the principal one right now is the Create Your Own Final, where you just let me know good questions or questions that you're interested in for the final exam. They can be in any form. You can have multiple guesses, fill in the blank, essay questions, and any other type of question that you could think of. And whenever I'm working on the final exam, which I'm going to be doing very soon, I'm going to consider those questions for inclusion. But you get 5 points added to your final grade. And I have not mathematically figured out what percentage that is of the course, but that's pretty significant for thinking up a few questions. So what you do is each week, you look at the reading from each week and think up a few questions for each week and post them in the format that I gave you in the Create Your Own Midterm section of the course. Also, please take advantage of the student feedback forum as well as the questions forum. I'm available to you if you have any questions at all. It's just like if we were in a classroom, you can ask me questions. You just have to write them down. So I'd love to hear from you, and I hope all of you are well.